I told this story before. It starts in a training area when I was on guard reserves. I had to do a 12-hour shift in a correctional facility. The facilities are old throughout the county, very old, and it was time for the medical examination of routine. So the nurse opened the small infirmary and the guards would take one inmate at a time. In the cell area we would make the inmates line up to go get their medicines. After we finished, the nurse left, and they closed the infirmary. All the inmates were back in their cells. I had to check the last block and then go back and make sure everything was closed. This was part of my patrol. When I was leaving, the shadow of someone on the floor, the shadow of someone crossing back to the infirmary ran to the end of the corridor, thinking that some inmate had evaded security to return to the medicine storage. When we got to the storage, no one was there, but clearly I saw the shadow of someone crossing from one side of the corridor to the other behind my back. A while later, other guards said, mocking me, receiving so much humiliation from my colleagues, I asked for my change as municipal police officer. A week after my change, my partner and I responded to a call for help. The place of the incident was an old office building that had been converted into doctors' offices. The alarm service reported that the motion sensor was activated in one of the upper offices. When we arrived with the person responsible that he had the keys, we proceeded to enter to check the building. The stairs were closed and there was a door that did not have a key. We took the elevator to get to the second floor. I know that it is not the most recommendable option tactically, and perhaps a procedural error. The elevator door opened into a completely dark corridor with absolute black except for a small light from a lamp at the end of the corridor. We started checking the doors and they were all closed. We got to the last one and, as you can imagine, I didn't have insurance. We went into what seemed to be an out-of-use office. The door led to a good-sized waiting room. There were about 10 or 12 exam rooms. We checked everything without any setbacks. We left the office, and something felt strangely wrong. Then we realized that the small lamp light was off. Now the one that was on was one of the lamps near the elevator at the other end of the hall. I looked at my partner and he was completely pale. Asked, "What is happening?" And he told me, all the doors that we just checked were not locked securely. Yes. Why? I answered, because now all the doors are open. And yes, I can swear, all the doors now went out into the corridor completely open, and I felt like vomiting. We began to check the offices to make sure. When we did it with the last one, now as we were leaving, the door slammed violently. Our radios seemed to have gone crazy, blaring full volume with possible static. At that moment we just wanted to get out of there at any cost. We got into the elevator and headed downstairs to contact again the employee who came to give us the keys. We couldn't find him. I radioed the station to ask for the phone number of the person in charge who gave us the keys and explain what happened upstairs. They told us that the building administrator was already on the way with the keys and would arrive in about 10 minutes. I replied that we had already spoken with him, that the person was in the same building, so the operator at the station asked me to call her on the phone. I called her and she told me that there was no way she could have talked to the administrator, the alarm company. She had just eventually been contacted by the administrator, my partner, and I didn't understand what was happening. A woman came. I asked her about the man who had let us into the building. She asked me to describe him, and from what I told her, she replied that he reminded her of one of the doctors who rented offices on the second floor at the end of the hall. Then, a little confused, she said that this man had committed suicide weeks ago in his vacation home. Thank God I never had to return to that place. 2 months later, they sent me to cover a report of a missing person. Apparently was a teenager. The city where she worked was very small, poor, on the outskirts of a large city. However, the street where this call had been given was very quiet, in one of the areas where there were rarely reports. The parents were both teachers. She took the report in the living room asking for all the information about her missing 15-year-old daughter. While writing down, the eldest daughter, who was in the room, pointed to the stairs and yelled, "Grandma!" Father ran to her yelling, "Mom! Mom!" He returned to the living room and asked me, "Officer, did you see her?" I asked him what was so strange that his mom had been on the stairs. He replied, "She died last year, but we had always walked him around the house." Trembling, I ended up taking the rest of the report in the garden. A year later they sent me to an operation on a stretch of highway. I was sitting on a hill next to a road monitoring the traffic. It was 2 or 3 in the morning. The place is quite well known because a person was found there murdered about 20 years ago, and the case could never be solved. And the other policemen did not use that hill for monitoring, even though the cars in that area were always going 15 or 20 kilometers per hour over the speed limit for the area. While I was monitoring, I saw a shadow walk near the trunk of the patrol car approaching from the passenger side. Almost immediately after, the shadow walked towards my side and then moved towards the front. The only thing that illuminated the place was the moonlight. All it was completely dark in that area. Thinking the worst, I turned on all the lights that I had by hand, the vehicles and my lamp, to see who is moving around me. But there was nothing. I thought that maybe it was time to leave the place. Once when I got to an illuminated area, I stopped, and I remembered that the patrol camera starts recording when I turn on the emergency lights. I looked at the recording and a figure can be seen walking from my door to the front of the unit. Then for half a second the camera clogged up as if someone put their finger on the lens, and then back to normal. Ever since I didn't use that place for night monitoring either. A few years ago, after retiring from the police, I was looking for a quiet job, and starting working with a security guard at a hospital doesn't sound bad, and it wasn't, except for the fact that the hours were from 9 p.m. 7 in the morning and I worked alone. The hospital I was guarding was abandoned. I was always a third shift officer. I don't scare easily, but this place could bring out the most fearful in me. Every night a wheelchair was heard through of the corridors that were supposed to be empty, in complete disuse. Every night I ended up closing doors, resecuring the doors over and over again. I ended up with a floor and continued. I began to get nervous when an hour after passing through a corridor I had to pay the same lights again, and close the same doors again. Or when I was walking down a corridor and heard footsteps upstairs, doors opening or closing, and elevators moving from floor to floor, phones ringing, the lights with which the sick called the nurses turning on, and so on. That kind of thing. But there were only 3 times when I was really scared like a child. The first time I was doing my rounds in the offices on the 4th floor. There was a light on in a locked hallway. This hallway hadn't been renovated since the place was built in the 1920s. I opened the door, turned off the light, walked outside, relocked the door, and turned to leave. Behind from me I heard the click of the light switch through the blurred glass of the door. I saw how the lights came back on. I decided to leave the corridor alone that night. The second time in the elevator, I was going to the last level when suddenly on the 4th floor I heard some laughter. And someone who was speaking in a low voice became louder the more the elevator went up. I reached the 5th floor. The doors opened. Absolute silence. Of course the lights were on even inside the rooms. I searched until the last corner, under the beds, behind the curtains. There was not a single living being on that level besides me. The third, or worst of all, was on what seemed like any given night. I was on the ground floor closing. I locked a door in one of the corridors. The door had a glass window in the middle, but the inside was covered with white tape. The room behind the door was dark, and the corridor a few steps behind me was something illuminated. Everything seems to be perfect. Everything is normal. Once the key is inside and the safety is on, turn the key, when behind me the perfect silhouette of a person passing through the corridor just behind me. I completely froze for a second. Then I reacted, and there I ran after the supposed person in the corridor. I found only a deep silence.